Thank you very much. This is quite a straightforward paper with a surprising result. And that is that social prosperity and economic prosperity lead separate lives empirically within the countries that I have checked. And this is going to be about the G20 countries. And it's an important question because social cohesion is required to tackle big problems like climate change, biodiversity loss, and so forth. And the implicit narrative underlying mainstream economics is what's good for the economy is good for society. And therefore, we can focus entirely on the circular flow of income and our economic system without reference to the social system within which it's embedded. And I will argue here the obvious, which is that it's impossible to understand much of what goes on in economics without understanding the social system within which economics is embedded. Everybody who has examined failed states knows that where the social system is not working, potential gains from trade aren't exploited, and so on and so forth. And society has big effects on economic activity, and economic activity has big effects on society, economic inequalities, strengthen social inequalities, and so forth. And therefore, on theoretical and empirical grounds, I'm just going to have a new look at this using a data source that has never been put together in this particular way. So this is based on a paper that I've written with my brilliant co-author, Fernando Ortega. What benefits the economy also benefits society, really. And the reason why this is such an important question is because, I say, it underlines why economics has been so dominant in public policy. And it also helps explain the separation of economic analysis from the social sciences. And this is exactly what I would like to comment to question. I'm going to be looking at two variables. One is economic prosperity and simply as output per person, just to keep things simple. And the output can be interpreted as consumption goods. Worry about that because economic analysis has handled that. And the second is solidarity. And solidarity, I define here as a set of psychosocial mechanisms that creates and maintains pro-social group-level functional organization. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but it is worth chewing this mouthful because human beings can operate in their capacity as individuals, and they can operate in their capacity as participants in the social groups to which they belong. And the social groups vary in size and in domain, economic, political, social domains, all have groups, the political parties, friends and family, and many others. And we derive our well-being in part from what it is that we consume and the things that we do in our capacity as individuals, but also from our participation in the well-being of the groups to which we belong. And one thing that distinguishes humans from other primates is that humans are very flexible in their capacity to associate with different groups. And the salience of one's affiliation with groups can vary through time and is highly context dependent. And one of the reasons why human beings have been so successful in the evolutionary process is that they have managed to create groups that match the size of the challenges that they face. And that's the reason why they were able to spread from the savannah to cover all parts of the globe and have been able to deal with new challenges as they've come along. So the level of functional organization is a really important level. In economics, functional organization is ossified. We've got households, they can be individuals or they can be families, but whatever they are, that's it. It doesn't change through time. We've got firms and their nature doesn't change through time, governments, banks, and so on. And here, the idea is that within the social sphere, but I can just as well argue in the political science sphere, the most interesting economic developments from innovation to productivity take place in the evolution of the levels of functional organization. So that's what I'm going to be looking at right here. This is embedded in a larger framework, and I just want to run it past you. This is the SAGE dashboards that a team that I'm involved in has put together, and that is now cooperating with the group in Harvard to connect it with their Human Flourishing Program. The SAGE dashboard stands for Solidarity, Agency, Material Gain, Environmental Stewardship, and we will be concerned with solidarity and gain. You're not the others. Agency is your ability to affect your environment through your own efforts, both individually and collectively. And environmental stewardship is exactly that. But what these things have in common is that they are needs, abilities, and values. So solidarity addresses the need for belonging, social belonging, absolutely. Basic human need, and it can be satisfied by our ability for prosociality. And we have moral values of care, love, and so forth that motivate us to use those abilities to satisfy those needs. It's not the only way of understanding moral values, but it's useful in this context. And material gain, the need is consumption, our ability is sustenance, and our value is utility. That's sort of standard. Those are the two variables that I'll focus on, and I'll start with an analytical framework. And sorry, you'll have to pardon my chicken tracks. But just to keep things really simple, I'll have two levels of functional organization, a communitarian one and a tribal. The tribal one, if you like, could be an individual as well. But whatever it is, even if it's a group of individuals, it's strong social ties in the fundamental sense. Communitarians, in this analysis, are Kantians. They behave in such a way that if everybody else behaves that way, it leads to the outcome that our conscience dictates. And we are assuming that there's homogeneity with a view to what the conscience dictates. And those communitarians can be conceived of as weak social ties. So this is society and this is community. So we've got solidarity functions. The communitarians, subscript J, there are N of them. Oops.
If you touch the screen,
I'm sorry, right. I'll never do that again. I'm very impressed by that screen. They're a function of all their contributions gives rise to solidarity, if you like, social capital, or whatever you want to call it. And the tribal people, they just care about themselves, and that's their contribution, and this is like a production function that yields their social capital. But these are social contributions and social outputs. Then you've got utility functions. I should skip down to the production functions. Their Q is just your input into the production process, labor, if you like. This is a productivity parameter, and that's the output. And it's really simple for both the communitarians and the tribalists. The utility functions are a function of your labor input, the consumption output, the contribution you make to your social networks, and the solidarity that arises from it, plus some error term. And for the tribalists, now the communitarians, they provide the social capital that is available to everyone in society. The tribalists take advantage of that, but in addition, they produce their own strong ties that are of no use to the communitarians or anybody else, to the individuals. And then you've got socioeconomic possibility functions that analyzed in great detail in another paper, but basically it tells you that if you want to produce this much output, then these are what enable you to do so. You need some social capital, you need to make some contributions to the social capital, both for communitarians and for individualists. So that is the framework. So if you can just keep in mind the Qs, the economic outputs, the Ys, so the social contributions, and the capital letters are the outputs. Okay, I've gone over this. So the communitarian decisions are to maximize utility, subject to this socioeconomic possibility constraint, and the solidarity function and the production function. And then the outcome of all of this are these solutions here that I'm not going to specify except generically, and they depend on N, which is the number of communitarians, because that clearly is relevant for the socioeconomic transformation function. And for the tribalists, they maximize utility subject to these functions. There's one extra one because they have their own social capital and they take advantage of the general social capital as well. And that's the solution to their problem. Now, I'm going to have a look at the evolution of social groups. This is the embeddedness. From this, I'll derive the embeddedness of economic activity within social activity. So a tribalist becomes a communitarian when the utility from being a communitarian, UJs, is greater than the utility from being a tribalist, plus the entry costs of entering the communitarian group and the separation costs of leaving the tribalists. There are these entry and exit costs because moving from one group to another is often costly psychologically and in other ways as well. And so this is the error term that is associated with the utility function of the tribalist. And so you get a condition for this error term. And therefore the entry rate into the communitarian group is given by this, which depends on, not surprisingly, on the difference between the utility from being a communitarian minus utility from being a tribalist minus the switching costs, identity switching costs. And similarly, a communitarian becomes a tribalist when it goes the other way. Then you get another condition that also depends on this difference between the utility from being a tribalist and being a communitarian. And from that, you get the separation rate from the communitarian group. So it's all really straightforward. You with me? Usually when I say you're really straightforward, I've lost everyone. So the evolution of communitarianism is clear. The change in the number of communitarians, N, is the entry rate, plus the number of tribalists, which is L, the total population minus the communitarians. So that's the number of people who've entered the communitarian group, minus the number who've exited, which is the separation rate, times the number of communitarians. Okay? And so you get this equation, difference equation of motion. We call that the identity dynamics function, where we need to keep in mind that the entry rate depends on the structure of society, which is given by N, the number of communitarians, and this theta parameter, which stands for the, it's like a shift parameter that tells you that the relative attractiveness of being a tribalist is relative to being a communitarian. It can also stand for the productivity parameter of the production function. You can show that. And so in general, in this phase diagram, where this is the number of communitarians in the next period, and this number of communitarians in this period, you can get multiple equilibria. I haven't specified this precisely, but here, the way I've drawn it here, there are two stable equilibria, this one and this one here, and an unstable one right in the middle here. So E3 is like a cohesive society. Lots of communitarians there. And what they have in common is that they're actually addressing a public good that is that can only be exploited if the group is of that size. So this is a cohesive society. This is a fragmented society. And this unstable equilibrium just tells you towards which society you move. Now, if the tribalists become more attractive relative to the communitarians, or if productivity rises because of labor-augmented technological change, then it can be shown that this identity dynamics curve shifts down and rotates. So in both cases, you can see that the equilibria, the cohesive society and the fragmented, the number of communitarians gets smaller. And if the shift is large enough, then this upper equilibrium may just vanish. You don't have any opportunity to reach a cohesive society at all. Now, I'm sorry. I tried really hard to connect to the internet because there is a mistake here, which I desperately tried to correct, and the technology beat me. But basically, this should be a Q and this should be an N, so that this diagram here tells you that if you just have a low level of output and you develop a larger community, or a larger society, people who cohere, then these two may be Edgeworth complements. the fact that you're interacting with people in a pro-social way helps you produce more stuff. But then after a while, it's possible that they become substitutes. That's when you become affluent, and then it goes down. So this distinction is entirely between Edgeworth complements and Edgeworth substitutes, and that just relies on the derivative of the socioeconomic possibility function. So and that implies also this type of relationship between productivity and solidarity, because the amount of solidarity you have depends on the number of communitarians. So this is the dynamic general equilibrium, where you wind up, depending on what your initial conditions are, in a cohesive society or in a fragmented society. And now this curve needs to be flipped around so that it looks like this. And then depending on where you are here, you can infer what the output will be. Now, this is, I think, sort of an important intellectual step that I've slipped in at the very end, which is you've got no way of knowing what the output in this society is unless you know what the structure of the society is. And so this is a truly embedded economy. And there is no necessary relation, monotonic relation, between aggregate output and the amount of solidarity. It's quite open, but it depends on certain things like Edgeworth complementarity and substitutability and various other things. The distribution of the underlying the entry and exit functions. So now let me give you the evidence on the basis of that. So all that this has done is hopefully extended your imaginative capacities to know that there is no necessary monotonic relationship between these two, and therefore it is possible for economic prosperity and social prosperity to lead separate lives. Basically, these nonlinear functions look like. I'm not going to bore you with all of this, but the numbers are in the public domain. They come from the Gallup World Poll. You can differentiate between inward solidarity and outward solidarity. Inward solidarity is this, the thick ties, and the outward solidarity are the thin ties. The question that we use for the inward solidarity is, if you were in trouble, do you have relatives or friends you can count on for help? That's really thick tie. Outward solidarity in the past month, have you donated money for charity? Have you volunteered your time, helped a stranger, got respect? So these are the thin ties questions. Now, here are the time series from 2010 to last year, and just have a look at them. There is, I'll give you some statistical properties of this, but you can see there is really no really close relationship among these things anywhere. They really do seem to lead separate lives. But the thing that I'd like you to focus on is United Kingdom. 2016 is the Brexit referendum, and solidarity fell. GDP just continued to rise. And since the Brexit referendum, solidarity has been going down and down, slightly up now. Probably influenced by the pandemic. In Indonesia, things sort of move in the same direction. But now here's an interesting one. Look at the United States. 2016 is when Trump becomes president the first time. There's a long slide of solidarity. GDP just continues to grow. So Hillary Clinton looked at the blue line and said, we've never had it so good. And on average, she was right. But had she looked at the red line, she would have had a different story. And I really do believe that solidarity alongside agency, which also has these worrying trends, does tell you something. Look, this is what happened to solidarity just before this election. It is not just the economy, student. There's something else going on. So let's try to derive some type of implications from this. So we can ask, do relatively prosperous countries also enjoy relatively high solidarity on average, where prosperity is measured by GDP per capita, very imperfect measure, but you don't know about the imperfections, and solidarity is measured the way we have it. And so you can see there are a number of countries that are unprosperous and fragmented, which just means that they're beneath average for the G20, and other countries that are prosperous and cohesive, and they're above average for the G20, and then you've got some that don't fit in. Japan is prosperous and fragmented. And got Argentina, Brazil, and South Africa being unprosperous and cohesive. But broadly, you can say there are significant exceptions, but there does seem to be taking averages over the entire time period. Something that the relatively prosperous countries do enjoy a relatively high solidarity. And then one needs to ask the question, which I will not be able to answer here, but we've done some other analysis on, is it the solidarity that is causing the prosperity, or the prosperity that's causing the solidarity? And we've got evidence that it is solidarity causing the prosperity around, which is what the model is meant to help you understand. Then you can ask, are solidarity and economic prosperity positively correlated through time in individual G20 countries? So you take these correlations and take them through time for the entire sample period, 2010 till now, and you ask, are they positively correlated? And the answer is they're only significantly positively correlated for these countries in dark, and they are a subset of the unprosperous countries. That tells you something. For the rest, there are no significant correlations. Okay, now performance. Economic performance I'm going to measure by economic growth rate of the economy. And here's solidarity and economic. And there too, it is not easy to see your way. They seem to be leading certainly distinct lives. And then we can ask, the same questions. Do relatively fast-growing countries also enjoy relatively high solidarity on average? So here I have ranked countries in accordance with their solidarity index. And here I rank countries in accordance with GDP growth per capita. You can see there's no relation between these ranks. The answer is definitely no. And if you take a scatter plot, you can see exactly why. You've got a subset of countries here that are growth leaders, but they're fragmented, low solidarity. Then you've got growth laggards, but cohesive, and they're up above. So there's certainly no positive relationship between solidarity and performance. And then you can also ask the intertemporal question, are solidarity and economic growth positively correlated through time in individual G20 countries? And the answer to that is no. None of these correlations is significant. So that is that's it. Now, what I have not done here is, question is, well, what is the right way of thinking about the appropriate combination of economic prosperity and social prosperity? And there I have convinced myself that social prosperity and economic prosperity are both completely different aspects of our well-being. It's a bit like asking someone who flies a plane, you need the plane to be at the appropriate altitude or at the appropriate speed. The answer is you really need both, and you need them in some combination with one another. And different countries have developed, different institutions are more successful than others to do that. But it is important certainly to look at the dashboard. And when countries are succeeding really well in terms of GDP, but not doing well in terms of solidarity, then at least it is useful to have that data out there to indicate that there is a potential problem, because we face lots of collective action problems for which solidarity is needed. And the aim of this group that is assembling the SAGE dashboard and developing it is that these figures in solidarity, agency, gain, and environment should come out to the same regularity as GDP. And that if people take into account a dashboard of measures, you arrive at a rather different understanding of how the country is doing than if you just look at economic performance. So in Germany, for example, now which I'm terribly unhappy because Germany is lagging in terms of economic growth, but in terms of solidarity and agency, it's doing quite well. But that's not widely known. So this is basically an argument for making this known, because these variables lead separate lives. Thank you.
Questions?
So we do.
Other people are being shy. I'll start off. Well, first, a really terrific topic, both to understand what's been going on in recent events, as well as kind of longer-term drivers of prosperity and economic well-being. So it seems a pretty reasonable hypothesis that social security, in some ways over the long term, must have something to do with our ability to organize economically and create prosperity. I just wonder whether the time frame of your data set is just too short.
Yeah.
13 years, also a small sample, G20.
Yeah.
That, if you read like Robert Putnam's work on social capital, these things take a long time to build up, and also have a lot of momentum to it. So, you could have, and maybe this is what's happening in some places like the US, where you have a, fragmenting society, drop in solidarity, but the economy keeps chugging along, kind of on momentum from the historic, a couple centuries of social capital, even though that capital is deteriorating. The economy still has momentum. Another question would be cultural interpretation of solidarity. I did note in your graphs, there's some clustering of countries, like the two that seem fragmented and high-performing economies were, Japan and South Korea, and the ones on the opposite corner were all Latin American. So just made me wonder whether something culturally is being picked up. And then my last question is, I like your definition of solidarity quite a bit, it's a fairly broad one, social mechanisms. But does that really match with the survey questions that you're using?
Right.
So for example, rule of law would be a social mechanism, and it may compensate for deficiencies in other areas. But, is that sort of thing getting picked up by the particular survey questions in your?
Right, okay. The answer to that question is no. There is a big gap between what it is that we'd like to answer and what it is that these survey questions actually do answer.
Yeah.
And this is not meant in any sort of defense, but there's a big gap between what GDP is meant to measure and what it actually does measure. That is well known, but it doesn't stop us from using GDP. And so the basic idea here was these measures are extremely imperfect. But if we start measuring countries, we've got 160 countries that we're currently measuring in this way, regularly, at least annually, and rank them, then that will be a spur for the generation of more data, better data, that will help us improve things. And the match will never be perfect, but I still claim this is better than nothing, just because we're capturing something that seems to be rather orthogonal to what we capture in economics. But absolutely right. The question that I'd love to have Gallup ask, which was not asked, that is, I think, the critical question, is, are you confident that your communities and societies can collectively address the collective challenges, the evolving collective challenges that you face? So it's a question about adaptability. That's the question that I'd really love to know, and that is then goes to the heart of flexible functional organization. But that question hasn't been asked, and been asked by Gallup to suggest new questions. But since we're interested in data sets for 10, 20 years, it will take a long time before we make any progress there. And in the meantime, I believe there are a lot of social problems that prevent us from addressing important collective challenges, and therefore we should go on the basis of what we have. Now, there are a lot more questions in Gallup that are relevant, and there are other data sources too. The problem is that we would like to restrict ourselves to data that is at least annual and covers lots of countries. So that really does restrict data sources. But yes, you're absolutely right. There's a big gap.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it was interesting to see sort of that those two things are so different, that social and economic prosperity are so different. But I'm curious if you looked at if there was any way to look at sort of how the benefits of that growth actually accrue to a population, so that sort of, I imagine solidarity and say things like wage growth or social expenditure or kind of public investment, that those two things might actually be much closer in line than say GDP and solidarity.
Solidarity and wage growth, investment would be more closely related to solidarity, you say.
Or I guess in the way that sort of GDP growth as a measure of like economic well-being of a nation, the mechanism through which those benefits actually touch people and society.
So we should look at the mechanisms. Okay, I'm not following entirely, or not understanding why those mechanisms, investment, productivity, should be more closely related to solidarity with GDP.
I guess just in the sense that those are the ways in which people would feel the benefits of economic growth? Because it's
Right,
sort of,
okay, so determinants of economic growth.
or rather, I guess the benefits and the positive consequences of economic growth. Like it's a different situation to live in a growing economy that is highly unequal, say, versus one in which the benefits of growth accrue to people either in income growth, wage growth, or public expenditure.
Okay, with regards to inequality, that I'm glad you mentioned that. One can derive, and we have distributions of solidarity, distributions of agency, and they are significant in understanding people's opportunities as distributions of income and wealth. And so one should see distribution of these things as sort of one separate topic that applies to all of these measures. I think one way to think about it in economic terms is take a firm with a labor force and two firms with two labor forces. In one case, people are willing to cooperate with one another, they help one another out and so on. In another, they're super competitive and try to put each other down. That will obviously affect productivity. And the question is sort of how best to capture that. And in the model that I gave you before, it will be captured in terms of these Edgeworth complementarities. And your question really does lead me to think much more carefully about what is it about economic success that we should choose as variables to connect with solidarity. To do that.
I think just to build on Ebba's excellent question, do you really want a measure of economic solidarity to pair with the social solidarity? So as you were talking, I was imagining the graph with, instead of just GDP, median income and top 10%, bottom 10%, are they growing together, which is economic solidarity, or are they like this? And the New York Times actually had a great graph a couple of days before the election showing relative economic performance of white males versus white females versus Black, Hispanic, et cetera, all these different groups. And you can see it all kind of coming apart, particularly white males going down relative to the other groups, which is a kind of economic sort of fragmentation that then played out as a social political fragmentation too.
Right. So okay, that's really useful. So going back to the distribution of solidarity, there is this other paper that, in fact, I think I presented here, where I show that the lowest decile in the income distribution in a lot of countries is also the lowest decile in the solidarity distribution and the agency distribution. And so, therefore, these people are really badly off because they don't get support when they're badly off, and they don't have the wherewithal to get themselves out of it either. Now, that is a separate issue from the issue, if you have economic inequality, to what degree does that unravel the social solidarity in the sense here and vice versa? So you can think of, and I think I'm glad you mentioned this, you can think of economic solidarity, so people helping each other at the workplace, and social solidarity.
Well, the economics, are we all sharing in the benefits of the system in a fair way?
Yes. No, that's right.
Because GDP may be going up, but it's just Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg making the money. I may not feel great solidarity with.
Right. And then there's political solidarity and social solidarity, and they all stand in some relationship with one another. It should really be differentiated from each other. And that the data is simply too thin to allow us to do. So what this this mixes a lot of things, the economic and the social. And I guess there is more data, we could say things about political solidarity too.
Can I add something to that before I ask my question? I mean, inequality would then quite change your average of solidarity in your graph. Like the US, it's huge inequality compared to, Canada or I don't know, Germany, but then they're both cohesive on the graph. So I think if you add that level, and some of it is obviously a perception versus, because a lot of these questions are, people feeling the solidarity themselves. So a lot of it is perception anyway. But I think that dimension would probably be really kind of like, instead of from a 2 planes to a third plane almost, because I think it would add quite a bit to this. And then I have a question.
Could I just say this is a really important point, which is we're just relying on aggregate figures. So aggregate GDP doesn't tell you anything about the distribution, and aggregate solidarity doesn't tell you anything about the distribution either. And there's a lot going on, and actually we're trying to analyze a complex adaptive system, and aggregates are not the way to do it.
Yeah. And also I think the term solidarity, I like it and I find it problematic at the same time. Because if you were to ask people, in terms of, I mean, this is very much like, to me, it reads like how connected you are to a group, rather than when I think of solidarity, I think everybody holding arm in arm and how united the country rather than fragmented. So the US is very fragmented, Germany is very fragmented. You give an example of Germany of being actually quite high on the solidarity despite otherwise. I think also I was in a meeting 2 or 3 weeks ago where the Minister of Climate Action and Economic Affairs himself, who's the Vice Chancellor, said economic growth will protect our democracy, and we're a very fragmented society. So that I think is and of course he means something else. He doesn't mean this. He means, are we, because obviously the rise of extremes and the political fragmentation. I think that, with you're looking at G20 country, I think that is something to kind of also consider to try to kind of get a better sense of what is driving this, because this is more of the people who really have a group. And when I look at your graph, it's also interesting, some of your, fragmented countries, there's also a line of democracy. And we know that countries with high democracy have a higher civic engagement, which seems to be quite related to this. And then if we look at your, there's only Japan and maybe Korea, which are, democracies in that sense, and then they're fragmented, but then the rest, even India, right? I mean, the rest have a really questionable democratic thing. And I think that's also underlying a lot of the solidarity. So I think there's something else happening here that is not perhaps captured in this by looking only at G20.
So I think this is a good thing about this analysis. It uncovers a big can of worms that is highly relevant to economics.
Right.
So things that are both causes and effects of economic activity should be included in our economic models, and they currently are not. And so this skims the surface of a lot of issues, and I've made notes. Clearly, we should separate solidarity in the political, social, and economic domains, and look at distributions. I mean, that's absolutely critical. It will be interesting to try, because our behavior depends not on the output of complex systems, but our sort of mental model of what is going on underneath. So to understand some basic stylized facts that may be underlying this will help our behavior. It doesn't necessarily describe the world terribly well, but it will tell us it can coordinate our action and tell us what to do, and therefore this type of exercise is not useless, but still far removed. And I think both of those issues, domains and distributions, we're looking into. Yes.
Yes, thanks for the interesting analysis, and I would be also very interested to see the Gini coefficient of the income distribution maybe, or also perhaps I'm wondering whether you can distinguish empirically between inward solidarity and outward solidarity, as you mentioned.
Right.
Two dimensions to it.
That's right. Now, there's another paper that looks at the difference between inward and outward solidarity, and we call that difference tribalism. And let's say there's a paper that we published in PNAS that shows that the COVID pandemic made G7 countries more tribal in that sense. So that is sort of interesting, and we would have needed to be less tribal. Now there's a
some questions on the chat.
Yes, so many thanks for presentation. Coordination and collaboration can be a complement of abilities that are especially important for dealing with global challenges such as climate change, and gets large output declines and can be explained by coordination and collaboration problems that might even create even conflict. That is most certainly true, and this does not look, it distinguishes between needs and abilities because we have production functions and utility functions. But when the solidarity increases and the number of communitarians increases and then output declines, that may itself have effects on coordination, as you say. So I completely agree with that. Which would need to be taken into account in the model, and it is, but is glossed over. Employment growth can be a good economic measure. That's a very good idea. I will thank you. Really appreciate that. I will make note of that. And Gini coefficients, yes, that's another paper. The problem with comparing the Gini coefficients of GDP, of national income, with that of solidarity and agency, is that solidarity and agency are measured on a scale from something to something. And so they're bounded from above and below, but GDP is not, and so the Gini coefficients need to be interpreted quite differently. And so we wind up using different measures to make them comparable. So that's it. Yeah.
I've seen researchers using blood donations also as an indicator of social. I think it's on a regional scale in Italy in this case, and it might be another alternative.
So blood donations, there is quite a bit of data on that, and virtually all the data that we've got here is subjective data, and blood donations are objective. That is really useful. One area where we've compared the objective with the subjective is in the environmental fronts, where you ask people how happy they are with their drinking water and the air and this and that. And then you get data on how good is your drinking water and how good is the air. And the two have very little relation to one another, both in time series and cross-section terms, which is very distressing. Good. One last one, yes?
Just maybe in Asia, I think it might be also difficult to have a comprehensive indicator, and my personal impression is that, for instance, Korea is called an elbow society, where there's very high competition among people, and also in China it's similar. But there might be another dimension in terms of like at the moment there's this discussion of the meritocracy, extreme meritocracy in this country. So maybe that's another thing. Also relates to cohesion, I think.
Absolutely relevant here, and co-authors may have written a number of papers on this. That you can divide economic activities into collaborative activities where you're both caring for each other, helping one another, or status-seeking activities. Those are competitive in a status-seeking way. And they pull in opposite directions with regard to solidarity. And one can investigate the conditions under which one is preferred to the other. And so, for example, technological change that falls preferentially on goods and services will tend to promote status seeking relative to caring activities, just because caring activities are relationships that don't benefit as much from those technological activities. And there's something similar going on here, where you can show that if you have growth that promotes productivity, then you will, if there are adjoint substitutes between social and economic side, society will gradually unravel. And if you don't want that to happen, you need to have a continual increase in solidarity promoting mechanisms to run alongside your productivity growth, which is something that's not generally acknowledged. Yes.
One last point. I think it's a bit relevant to something Eric said about culture. It's interesting that there's also a clear geographic divide in the countries. So the countries that are not, the countries that are fragmented on the solidarity, they're basically, there's only Mexico from Latin America, but then the rest are Asia, East Europe, Middle East. And then the countries that are not fragmented, they're Western countries plus a couple, Brazil and Argentina. And even South Africa, I could say, it's African, but in many ways also the Western leading economic system. That I think is probably something also driving a lot of this, the questions, again, captured in your solidarity, which are related to culture, but also to the larger mores of the area, I think.
And part of that is covered by Eric's point.
Yes, exactly.
Invested in social capital in the past and maybe living off that.
Yeah, but that it's very related. It poses the question whether that's something that's easily changeable or not, right? If these are institutions or cultures and mores that are very deep, it's very difficult to change.
Now that was the presumption with which I started on this journey here.
Sorry, I might have missed
saying
this.
that these things don't change very much, and so look at the solidarity measures, they're all over the place. They're zigzagging up and down. So you can certainly change people's perceptions of how cohesive society is, and that does have influence. So solidarity is not a constant that you can forget about and focus on economic fluctuations. Yes.
So with all the variation year to year in your solidarity metrics, how sure can we be that it's measuring some real underlying effect versus just some random noise of solidarity in Germany or the US going up and down?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. These measures are based on subjective evaluations. And now the question is, do these subjective evaluations matter? And the answer is yes, clearly yes, because they'll determine helpful you'll be to other people and your ability for collective action. Um, uh, and how much is just generated by noise due to data? That's something that Gallup has done a reasonable amount of work on, and I need to investigate the statistics more closely.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think, yeah, some more digging into what we really mean by these concepts and then what data gets at those. I was also thinking of the difference between, what we think of as social capital, sort of Putnam's definition and your definition of solidarity. In some ways they strike me as having a similarity, yes, a set of psychosocial mechanisms. Again, that seems to imply institutions, culture, which are kind of a stock in some way, which is similar to Putnam's notion. Whereas these questions are getting up at more of a momentary feeling.
Yeah.
A
From this.
psychological state that may be arising from, those things, but maybe more noisy.
So I think you really hit on something really important. It's a distinction between stocks and flows. So you can think of institutions and so on that give you the opportunity for generating solidarity, which you may not be in the process of activating because there's no occasion for it and so on, but the opportunity is there. That's a stock. And the flow is what you're actually doing or taking advantage of. And that is what this measure of solidarity measures. It's the flow that obviously depends on the stock, but is not the same. And obviously flows are much noisier than stocks are. And if one were to empirically calibrate the model that I had before, you would construct the stocks from the flows. So that would be a different way of measuring social capital. The trust can be accumulated through the exercise of social solidarity. So there is a link between that and Putnam's understanding of social capital, but it's definitely not the same things.